the live. Good afternoon for our colleagues in Europe. Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here with you here again today. My name is Thatyanne Gasparotto. I'm the Associate Director for Regions for CBI, and I am very, very honored to be here with such a fantastic group of panelists today for what I think is our much awaited transition day, where we will be talking about all things transition throughout the day. And for this session, I would like to kick us off by talking about buildings, transport, and agriculture. To kick us off, I would like to thank our amazing sponsors, without which this conference wouldn't be possible. So I would like to thank JP Morgan, our global sponsor, Credit Suisse, Ping An, Moody's ESG Solutions, Luxembourg Green Exchange, Citi, Refinitiv, BNP Paribas, IHS Markit, Allianz Bernstein, FSD Africa, IDB, ICMA, Mitsuho, IFC, and Ashurst. So before we start, I would just like to make a few announcements for housekeeping. I would like to invite the audience to use the Q&A box to ask questions, as well as send other comments or queries to the chat. Our team is managing that, and we will be able to direct your questions as we go through the panel. There is live translation available in Portuguese, Spanish, Mandarin, Japanese, and French. If you would like to continue to listen to this session in English, just leave the original audio channel on. All sessions are being recorded, and you will be able to listen to any of the sessions that we've had throughout the week until November. Please do make the most of the platform. There are some very, very interesting tools that it offers, so you can network with thousands of attendees. Also check out our virtual booths. And for those media participants out there, if there are any interview requests, please visit the Climate Bonds virtual booth to arrange those. Thank you very much for all of you here with us today. So for this panel, I would like to introduce our esteemed panelists, starting off with Cristina Gamboa, who's the CEO of the World Green Building Council. Welcome, Cristina. We also have Marcelo Marzola, who's the CEO of Vayda Farms. Nice to have you with us, Marcelo. David Taff, who's the CEO of Siemens Investment Co. Brazil. Hi, David. And finally, we've got Dominik Englert, who's the economist from the Transport Global Practice at the World Bank. Great to have you with us as well, Dominik. So without further ado, I would like to kick off this discussion and give just a little bit of context as to what we will be debating here today, and then obviously pass on the floor to our panelists, who are the ones we're here to listen from. So why these sectors? And obviously we've been talking about transition for a while, which I'm sure you've heard in some of the earlier sessions as the day started. Why have we selected these three sectors for this session? So we're talking a lot about transition right now. For a number of sectors, it's still a step to go, and it will involve steep technological transformation. For some sectors, as you have heard, we don't have clear pathways and yet on transition, and we're working on it. But there are sectors that already have clear pathways, and this is what we want to talk about today. So we know what we have to do, or we have at least a pretty good idea of what are the options available out there, and that's how we came to buildings, agriculture, and transport. And hopefully it will all connect and make sense as we move through the panel, and also getting that that perspective from the other side, from the investor side, which we will be able to discuss as well. So once again, I do invite everyone to please share their questions as we go through the panel, and we will be directing them to our panelists. So I would like to start off with the building sector. And Cristina, lovely to have you here with us. According to the Build Upon report, which was launched by the World Green Business Council in June, buildings are responsible for 40% of energy consumption in the EU, and 90% of buildings that exist today in the region will still stand in 30 years' time. This means that there is great potential for financing building renovation to further decarbonize the sector. So from your experience, does the built environment sector have a clear transition pathway defined already? Where are we kind of in that spectrum? And if so, can you share what are the key milestones that contributed to establishing that roadmap, both for the EU and globally?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. And hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be joining you today. Yes, the building and construction sector does have a transition pathway defined. I guess we at the World Green Building Council, we have been convening wide partnerships to develop what is the way forward. And of course, as the science also comes forward, we refine those pathways and the urgency. I guess the result of that roadmap or consultation that is also included into the human settlements pathway, if you like, from the UN, that includes the sector. So this, what I'm talking about, is amply agreed upon. We know that by 2030, we need to have emissions in the building and construction sector. And the milestone that has been agreed is that we need to start at zero. All new buildings, infrastructure renovations have to be at least 40% less embodied carbon. That is all the carbon also that is like upfront loaded even before the building is set up. And of course, that will lead that all new buildings will achieve the highest energy performance possible by 2030. That is critical because a lot of the world is still urbanizing at a very high rate. And of course, the 2050 goal is full decarbonization, but I guess, how do we translate that then into local action? We're here with an investor and finance community. The building and construction sector is also a non-tradable sector, very local. Meaning that, of course, we have this big ambition, but how do we do that on the ground? There's many gaps. There's no way about it, but we're very pragmatic. And how do we advance? You mentioned that in the EU, we are working in 10 national decarbonization roadmaps and an EU-wide decarbonization roadmap for the sector, with the support of the IKEA and the Laudes Foundations and the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction. Meaning that we translate those principles and what we know can be done today into the relevance of cities and place and regulations. And so we are facilitating a common understanding on how the whole value chain needs to transform. And Europe in particular has a huge challenge in existing buildings, and financing renovation is key to that and achieving, if you look, I'm going to introduce here, if you like, assets are 50% of the wealth worldwide. And if you look into your own portfolio, it's your own 50% of our personal wealth is invested in buildings. And before all of this came about, the climate ambitions, we already have this huge infrastructure that is not fit for purpose. So we need to go through those renovation barriers, unlock them, get the renovation strategies right. There is the renovation wave from the EU happening. The green mortgages are very prosperous now in Europe, thanks to the green mortgages pilot project that already covers 50% of mortgages in the EU. It's a big market, but we need more. We need the skills. We need every cent of being spent in infrastructure, being in infrastructure that is fit for purpose.
Absolutely. And it's interesting. I was just making some notes while you were talking. It's it's interesting because there is a large role of individual investors as well, right? Unlike some of the other sectors where you are kind of limited to the institutional side, but individual investors are across the board for buildings. At the same time, I think it is one of the sectors that we've had kind of this transition-like approach to it for a long time, because usually, criteria, certainly, CBI criteria, but, other initiatives out there are, they have, moving targets, and it does grow with ambition. It does grow in ambition with time. And finally, I think one of the things that we've seen is exactly the there will be two very, very distinct approaches for the building sector, depending on where you are, right? Or more than two. But you mentioned a lot of retrofitting, and it's interesting when we look at the emerging markets. I've been saying, we have a chance to build better. We shouldn't be just, thinking about building back better, because hopefully we won't have to build back. But in places, and especially in countries where we have, a large infrastructure deficit, and we're trying to close that, we should be aiming at building better from the start, so we're not having to invest so much in retrofit in the future. So that's,
and I could add, add to that, because let's say the retrofit challenge in Europe, we know that renovations rates need to be 2-3%. We're around 1.2. If renovations rates don't go up there, we're not meeting Paris. Building and construction sector energy consumption is almost 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So this is a critical climate solution that is quite untapped. And from the emerging sector that you were saying, the emerging markets, IFC actually has a report saying just efficiency, energy efficiency in buildings, is one of the biggest investment opportunities, worth 24.7 trillion by 2030, meaning that we need to be more, it's going into 2030 with the ambition, and we know it's the time, and this conference is accelerating that green window in order to bring the urgency, but also bring the confidence to the investment community that this is an investment opportunity, because better quality assets will have better performance, better valuation, will bring down costs of operation, and of course, will deliver better outcomes for people, planet, economies, and communities. So it just makes business sense, but I guess it's coming to the realization that this transition is doable, and bringing in finance will accelerate what needs to happen.
That's excellent, Cristina. Thank you. And exactly right. I mean, we're talking about long-term investment decisions with assets that will be here for at least 30 years.
100. Some of them
100
more.
for hundreds. Yeah, exactly. That I'm sure is something that should be very high on the institutional investors list when thinking about those assets. So thank you for that. So if we, we're talking about long-term investment, also long-term transition risk. If we switch gears a little bit and talk about a sector that actually has very, very short-term impact. And I think, unlike most sectors, sometimes lack of investment towards resilience or, in best production practices can have actually almost a daily impact on performance and productivity, which is agriculture. So I wanted to switch over to our panelist, Marcelo. If you can take us through, what are we talking about when we talk about transition for agriculture? It's clear that we need to decarbonize agriculture food systems, and we need to, significantly transform business models and production practices globally in order to meet increasing demand. So also, while we're shifting or seeking to shift consumption patterns in some of the other sectors, I think it's pretty clear that with agri-food systems, the demand is only going to grow. So where do you think we are in terms of the sector's pathway to transition?
Thank you, Thatyanne, for the question, and thank you for the invitation to be here. It's a true honor to represent agriculture in this very important panel. I love your pathway analogy because if we look at our pathway in agriculture, it's a clear pathway. Unlike a lot of sectors in agriculture, we see a very good alignment between conservation agriculture or climate smart agricultural practices and profitability, which makes things a little bit easier from one side of the discussion. But it is indeed a long and steep pathway that we have ahead of ourselves. And I believe what the agriculture sector is doing right now is starting to learn how to leverage all of the very important efforts that are being carried out and trying to build some coordination. So what I would say to your question is there is a lot of momentum, there's a lot of energy. Part of that has to do with the fact that, as I said, that the transition is obvious from the economic and from the ecological side. So there's a good convergence there, which makes things a little bit easier. There's energy coming from government and policymakers, from industry leaders in equipment manufacturing, seed companies. So a lot of the very important stakeholders in the agricultural sector are already talking about regenerative agriculture and just about climate smart agriculture, as some prefer to call it. I believe, however, that the challenge that we have ahead of ourselves now is how to make all of that great energy that we can see right now work in a coordinated fashion. Agriculture, as we all know, has a very complex supply network. So we have to make sure that all of the parts of this network are working in a coordinated fashion if this is to be a successful endeavor. And I think that's where we are. So a lot of energy, a pretty clear pathway ahead of ourselves, a lot of opportunity both from the ecological and from the economical side. However, we still need to find out the best way to make the key stakeholders work together.
Thank you, Marcelo. And yeah, I think we definitely came across some of those challenges as you outlined when we were doing our own criteria for agriculture last year. And I think like you said, we've got that clear pathway, what needs to happen within the farm gate. I would also like to hear if you can just comment briefly on, I think, the scale as well, because I think a lot of people comment on, we've been hearing about climate smart agriculture and we know it's very successful in some places and regenerative ag as well. But I think there's still kind of this misconception in the market or, preconceived image that, it's all very niche and it's all very small scale, but actually, it's not what's going to meet, the demand for global demand for food and so on. Can you comment on the scale element? Because obviously, we're talking about feeding 9 billion people here. Just interested if you can comment on that point.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point, Thatyanne. I truly believe that there are many low-hanging fruits, for the lack of a better metaphor. So no pun intended here, but there's a lot of low-hanging fruits in the ag sector. So sometimes if you think about regenerative agriculture, it's easy to think about very complex systems, agroforestry, that kind of thing, which always seems to be something more directed at smaller scale production as opposed to larger scale production. But honestly, there are so many different opportunities. There's so much in our toolkit to improve the environmental impact of agriculture when we think about large scale practices and small scale practices, that the opportunity is everywhere. So I'll just give you a practical example of what I mean by that. If you take, for example, where we're farming right now in the USA, one of the issues that every farmer has, and it doesn't matter if it's a small scale, large scale farmer, is with soil compaction, right? So the more compact the soil, the harder it is for crops to grow, generally speaking. The technology to work with soil compaction or around soil compaction has been around for quite a while. So you have everything from tracks on the tractors to low compaction tires to something that was developed a long time ago, which is a GPS, right? So if you go back to the practical operation, I just want to give you a very practical example of the kind of very simple low-hanging fruit that's around. Something that any farmer can do is use controlled traffic patterns, which basically means that you're running your tractors or your equipment always on top of the same lines in a way that you're not crisscrossing your field and creating greater soil compaction. If we just say, okay, I hire a custom applicator or someone that's going to come to my farm and do an operation, and I don't specify that I would like to control the traffic patterns, that person is just going to go around the farm in whichever way they think is best fit. And we would assume that this being such a developed technology, it would be pretty run-of-the-mill operation. Everyone would ask for that. But the reality is that if you go, again, I'm talking about America, where we're farming right now, that's not the default. So if we don't say that we would like to use controlled traffic patterns, we're just going to have our fields crisscrossed and compacted, and that's going to be an impact on how lively that soil is, right? I'm giving you a very simple example. This is very, very simple, but it's something that goes a really long way. And if we're going to use practices such as these that can be used by any farmer at any scale, anywhere, we have to make them available. And that's the other part of the discussion, is how do we get this to the farmer? How do we make this technology available to the farmer at the end of the day as well?
Thank you for that. And yeah, I think, sometimes the market still doesn't know about some of the very almost kind of, low cost or lower cost or zero cost opportunities that there are out there in agriculture. And we've definitely been seeing this in some of the work that we've been doing in Latin America. So thank you, Marcelo. I wanted to kind of turn over now to probably the sector that crosses all other sectors, which is transportation, right? So we need to ship things from one place to the other globally, be it, the construction materials that Cristina was talking about, so we can have efficient buildings, as well as all the commodities that are being produced out of the ag sector. And I feel like we need to talk a lot more about maritime transport as well. So Dominik, what is your perspective for the sector to achieve net zero emissions, especially in terms of technological advancements? And why do you think it's so important to, unlock the financing for the transition to happen now? So if you can give a little bit of color to the specificities of the sector, as well as any key milestones until 2050. Over to you, Dominik.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for the question, Tati. And you are fully right. We do need to talk more about the shipping sector. It is very, very often underestimated in terms of relevance and in terms of environmental impact. Relevance, just to give you a very, very simple example, if you or my fellow panelists or our audience here, if you look around in your office and look at all the items, products, and so on, goods that you have there, 80% of these have been carried by a ship at some point of time. So shipping is really responsible for 80% of global trade. And at the same time, shipping is responsible for 3% of global anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. I know that 3% doesn't sound that much, but if you put it in absolute terms, this is more than Germany's annual emissions. So definitely nothing that we should overlook. What are the perspectives for the sector? I would say the perspectives are very, very promising. We know more or less exactly what we need to do. We need to do two things in order to get to net zero. The first thing is we need to exploit the entire energy efficiency potential that the sector still hasn't exploited yet because of many market failures and many market barriers. But energy efficiency is only going to get us down to a certain level, and the sector still keeps on growing. So for the rest, we need something that is equally important, and that is we need to get rid of heavy fuel oil as the dominant fuel in the shipping sector, and we need to shift to these new so-called zero carbon bunker fuels. And in a recent report that we published in April at the World Bank, we came to the conclusion that the most promising zero carbon bunker fuel options in the shipping sector that are able to fully decarbonize the sector are going to be green hydrogen and green ammonia. And in terms of where the sector is headed to is the current target of the sector is to reduce emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, by at least minus 50% compared to 2008 levels until 2050. But more and more stakeholders are now calling nowadays for full decarbonization by 2050, so really zero emissions within the next 3 decades. There is a particular challenge to that, and the problem is that ships have a very, very long asset lifetime. So ships usually are on the ocean out there for something between 20 and 30 years. What does this mean? This means that all the ships that we're going to build and finance and build and put out on the ocean today are very, very likely to still be out there by 2050. And this implies that we need to finance zero carbon vessels, or at least zero carbon capable vessels right now in these years, in the coming years that we are facing now. And there is a lot of industry action. For example, there is the Getting to Zero Coalition, a powerful alliance that really has got the goal of putting deep sea zero carbon vessels out there by 2030 in critical mass. And what they have estimated together with the University Maritime Advisory Services is that what we need really to achieve this energy transition, to get an S-shaped energy transition curve in the shipping sector, is we need by 2030, 5% of the global bunker fuel mix needs to consist of zero carbon bunker fuels. I'm talking about this green hydrogen, green ammonia, but also biofuels or synthetic fuels. And then we have to upscale this considerably. 5 years later, it needs to be already at 27%, 10 years later at 93%, so that we can ultimately achieve the 100% by 2050.
Wow. So basically, I think we can clearly grasp the sense of urgency there, right? To avoid us locking in, a whole another fleet, a whole other round of ships that will be incompatible with a 2050 trajectory. And that's and it's interesting, and I'm keen to hear you talk about the opportunities as well, and I think some of the drivers behind it. So I'm going to go over to David now, so we can talk about the investor perspective. But we're getting a few questions from the audience as well, so I will come back to you, Dominik, with a couple more questions. So David, we're talking about a lot of investment here. We need investments across the board. We've got a whole menu for you to choose from, you and your colleagues. And I think, taking the transition discussion one path further, we're talking about transition pathways for all these sectors here, but we also need to shift investor portfolios. So almost like an investor transition as well, a portfolio transition. Especially to account for these medium and long-term risks, right? We're talking about locking in investment for built assets from the building sector. We're talking about locking in investments for transport and obviously in agriculture, investments that will be very sensitive to performance in light of physical risk and the effects of climate change. Change in precipitation patterns, increased temperatures can completely make or fail crops globally if the right practices are not employed. So as an investor, what are the main hurdles that you would face when investing in these sectors, as you are trying to identify assets that are on the right path or not? And if you can talk to us a little bit about what you're looking for, or what would you look for, and some of the questions that you would be asking.
Okay, that's quite a question, Thatyanne.
Very easy.
First of all,
30 seconds for you.
Thanks so much for the invite. It really is a pleasure to be here with you and my fellow panelists today. It's very exciting to be on this stage with you guys discussing this. I guess a couple of comments from on my side. I think as I hear the panelists talk about the different industries, I'm coming to an understanding of what the role is for investors like us in this transition. Realistically, what can we do? What can we not do? And one of the things that comes to mind is when we're talking about investing in making new investments. For example, we know that we're going to add quite a significant number of people, especially in Asia and in Africa, over the next 25 years. Their energy consumption, their food consumption, their transportation needs, their standards of living are going to put increased demands on all the types of investments we've discussed. So when you're making new investments, it's pretty clear that we're all cognizant of the catastrophe, the calamity we want to avoid. And then the choice is actually pretty clear. We want to be investing in sustainable and ESG compliant assets. However, when you're talking about divesting or cleaning up your portfolio from assets that you've previously invested in, you necessarily are talking about selling that to somebody else. So you're really not. So I can become more green by getting rid of legacy investments, such as we do have in Siemens Financial Services, but only by having somebody else buy them. So in that sense, it's a zero-sum game. I think the saving grace to that is that to the extent that and BlackRock has started showing leadership in this sense, to the extent that we start showing leadership and we start making these choices and divesting, the good side of that is that we're going to be raising the cost of capital, or I expect that we're going to be raising the cost of capital and making other types of investments much less profitable. So I'm hoping that is one way that we're making contribution. The other way, which I think is actually perhaps underrated, and I think it's important, is leadership, thought leadership. Participating in events like this, adding our voice to the voice of people who are supporting, thinking about, and essentially, making it patent that we want we want an ESG compliant future. We do want to achieve net zero. And I'm going to give you just as an introduction, I represent Siemens Financial Services, the equity side, the private equity / venture capital arm of the company. I don't lend. I'm very much based in Brazil, very much focused on energy, which I think touches on all of these sectors, the consumption of energy. And one of the things you have seen for here is corporate leaders, financial institutions, even the central bank in Brazil send a very clear statement to the government that they don't support deforestation, that they are extremely concerned about the environment. And that kind of leadership actually is important in terms of affecting policy and in terms of hiring people who want to work, not just in places we're going to be getting a salary, but increasingly we're seeing people are mission driven and motivated. So in all those ways, I think we can contribute. Some of them are sort of soft. And in that sense, Siemens has in the past been very involved and still is in some minority business, still is involved in providing equipment and energy and other types of solutions and services for the oil and gas industry, which I imagine will continue to play a role, a smaller one, I hope, in the future, a much more expensive one. But so we have a legacy of assets, and we are, in fact, in a moment of transition. We are reviewing our portfolio. We have clear goals of what we want to achieve in terms of rebalancing our portfolio towards sustainable, and not just sustainable, but ESG investments. And I was going to give you a sample. I don't know if I have, one more minute or a few more, how much more time I have. I was going to give you a sample of some of the questions we are now asking of all our investee companies to provide us answers so that we can put them on a map and so we can understand, okay, exactly what does our portfolio look like? So give me a sign, Thatyanne, of how much time I have left, and I'll tailor very little. So, okay, so we're asking questions of all of our investee companies. How much, are we either avoiding emissions or currently participating in creating emissions? What's the public perception of our investment, so we can capture qualitative items that we may not be aware of? Are we displacing people or indigenous people from lands? Is the land we're using for our projects previously zoned for industrial use or not? What's the impact on the ecosystem we're having? What's the impact of not going ahead? We are requiring our investee companies for the first time to show us an environmental management plan. I work with a lot of distributed generation companies. We've asked all of them to make sure, or at least tell us if they're aware if the solar panels they're using, which are sourced in China, have any content of forced labor. So there's an awareness, there's a purpose, but like everyone else, we're figuring this along as we go.
That was a very useful sample you shared with us, David. It is. I think we get these questions a lot in terms of issuers that want to know, okay, but what are investors asking as they want to prepare as well. So that and I think you touched on a point that it's we've been talking a lot about just transitions as well, right? And the truth is the whole world will need to transition. Unfortunately, we are in a situation where it's not where probably the most vulnerable, potentially some probably some of the places that have contribute less in terms of emissions will suffer the worst impacts of climate change. So the transition needs to be across the board, and I know there is a lot of discussion right now for concessions and grace periods and all of that, and the truth is we've run out of that. We have no more time for that. So we do need to account for geographical specificities. We do need to account for local contexts, but bearing in mind that there is only one time frame to work against, as much as we would love to have leeway here and there. And I think the social element will play a part in that for sure, because of impact. So interesting to hear what you're asking. And so I'm happy to say that actually we're getting lots of questions through the chat. We'll see how many we can go through. I wanted to share the first one with Cristina, which says, So agree with Cristina that retrofitting existing EU buildings that account for 40% GHG is vital in the EU, but low-income households are not qualified for green mortgages and can't afford the retrofit cost, such as air source heat pump or hydrogen boiler. What are the government and financial sector doing to help the poor to alleviate fuel poverty and achieve social equality?
Thank you so much for that question, because yes, this is such, let's say, a big challenge, such a big transition, that of course green mortgages is part of the journey, but we do need a mix of financial support and some government leadership, because we do have very diverse households, families, and challenges. So I would like to offer 3 things that are our way forward to addressing this challenge for those different types of households and what we can do to support them. There can be subsidies targeting the fuel poverty, right? And usually the worst performing buildings are often correlated with the less well-off occupants. Yes, so an understanding of the building stock, its current inefficiency, and of course, its lack of comfort, its lack of heating and cooling in other geographies, if you like, usually goes hand in hand with households that have less income. There's a silver lining, and it's the example I have is from the EU. There is a just transition fund for this to try and address this. But of course, it does need leadership in terms of cities and governments, driving forward policies that bring clarity on the direction of travel. Yes, and that the intent is to decarbonize the built environment, but of course, bring energy solutions, hopefully clean energy solutions for those that are lacking comfort and even basic services in their homes. And that means that we have to solve again the renovation part of the equation with skills, with finance, and the elements are there. The political will is there, but of course the scale and speed isn't, because we still need to bring more of the finance sector on board in that this is doable. And there is of course also an investment opportunity even in the lowest segments of the population.
Absolutely, thank you, Cristina. And yeah, so it looks like, combination of, we need clear policy drivers as well to push this and maybe get the speed that you're talking about, but also, raising market awareness that this is an opportunity, and there is an opportunity, with money to be made about from investing in transition and for these categories as well. Thank you for that. So I wanted to just move over to the next question, which is actually kind of, there's three parts to it, but for you, Dominik, so first, is there a role for electrification in maritime transport? So obviously we've been talking a lot about land-based transport and electrification in that, and I mean, we've been talking like in the sustainable finance landscape. What about for maritime transportation? And while you're talking about that, is there a role for biofuels as well? And how do these alternatives compare to hydrogen in terms of cost and technology readiness?
Thanks a lot, Tati. The electrification question is a very relevant one, and electricity is going to play an important role, but a different role that what many people may think. There is a smaller direct role and there is a giant indirect role for electricity in shipping. The smaller direct role is, yes, it is totally possible to electrify vessels. However, without a revolutionary breakthrough in battery technology, only ships that can recharge very frequently, for example, ferries or coastal ships, or service ships that go from the mainland to whatever offshore wind parks or so on a constant basis, that makes sense to electrify them. For deep sea shipping, this means ships that cross the Atlantic, that cross the Pacific, and so on, the batteries would be so huge that there would be no cargo space left where you can store any freight on the ship, and that would basically defy the purpose of maritime transport. But having said this, there is a giant indirect role for electricity in shipping, because these new zero carbon bunker fuels that I've mentioned, green hydrogen or green ammonia, will require tremendous amounts of renewable electricity to be produced. And why is this very, very good news for many countries, especially developing countries around the world? Because in the past, you needed oil reserves to produce heavy fuel oil, bunker fuels for the shipping sector. You either had oil or you were not part of the bunker fuel market. Now in the future, with the zero carbon bunker fuels, you will need a lot of renewable energy resources. And those resources, in contrast to oil, that's a potential that many, many more countries around the world have and can exploit. And therefore, the World Bank, for example, expects a realignment of the global bunker fuel market over the next decades, with many, many more countries entering this market, which have traditionally not been part of it. And this, of course, offers tremendous business and development opportunities for these countries, especially developing countries. You've also asked about biofuels, and biofuels will play a role in the future fuel mix of shipping, but most likely a slightly less significant role than hydrogen and ammonia, for a very, very simple reason. And the big reason is scalability. You need, for biofuels, you need a lot of sustainable biomass in order to produce them. And we live on a limited planet kind of with planetary boundaries. And it is very, very unlikely that we will find enough sustainably sourced biomass, so biomass that doesn't come at the expense of food security, for example, or at the expense of forestry and so on, that can be harvested in order to produce these a sufficient amount of volumes of biofuels for the shipping sector. If it was the shipping sector alone, it would probably work out somehow. But we are also talking about the aviation sector. We are talking about the ground transportation sector. We're talking about the energy sector. We are talking about bioplastics. So there's going to be cross-sectoral competition for these fuels, which basic economic principles is going to drive up demand, it's going to drive up prices, and therefore they are likely to be non-competitive compared to these other fuels that I mentioned, hydrogen and ammonia.
That's a very interesting perspective, Dominik, and I think one that we are facing, globally when we talk about biofuel being produced in different places, and what the global demand would be. And I know, in the aviation industry, there is a lot of focus right now in advanced biofuels and so on. So it's interesting to have that perspective in terms of how these different alternatives combine and compare. Right. So thank you very much for that. And I was just with this image in my mind of this giant ship now with a massive battery, and which obviously wouldn't work. So thank you for making that comparison. Right. So moving on to another question. We were talking about the financing earlier, and kind of the different structures, and obviously these three sectors I think are probably very distinct in terms of how they're financed. But Marcelo, I think probably one of the sectors where the lines are most blurry is probably agriculture, right? Where there's finance flowing everywhere. From within the farm gate and outside the farm gate. It's sometimes the input providers are also providing finance, and the producers are advancing contracts with potential buyers, and It's all very, very interlinked, which means also that it also creates even more levers for change and for pushing for transition. So I was hoping, we've been talking about the places where we see a clear pathway for transition now. So maybe I can go a bit off script and talk about some of the the places where we don't have that clear pathway. And I know CBI is about to embark in looking at agri-food systems as a whole and what transition would look like for that. But I wondered if you could comment a bit on that, as we move further downstream in supply chains, from the finance perspective, and investments, where do you see the big pushes for transition coming from? Thinking about kind of all the players midstream, downstream, where's that going to come from?
That's a great question, Tati. So I can think of two major points that I believe have to advance and are kind of gatekeepers to a greater push in the financing side of this green revolution that we have to go through. So the first thing is, we're used to a supply system that has very clearly identified positions. So you have the producer, you have the intermediaries, you have the logistics, you have the CPGs, you have the retailers, you have the consumer, right? So it's a pretty well-defined boundary between all of these parts in this value system. So the first thing that I believe has to happen is a kind of redefinition of the extent of these boundaries, in a sense that these parties need to start to work a little bit more together and understand and collectively try to better figure out what the risk is in the production, all the way from the farm to getting the food to the end consumer. And the risk sharing between these different parts of this value system has to be rethought in a way that, just to give you a clear example of what I mean by that, in a way that the CPG would potentially participate in some of the risk that's being held by the farmer today, as opposed to merely being a buyer of something that's being produced at the farm, right? So the moment that we start to bring attributes to crops and then onto products that have to do with what's happening throughout the value system, including the farm, is the moment there that we need everyone in this value system to be held accountable for the correct observance of those attributes. So it doesn't matter if the farmer is producing in a climate smart way. However, the logistics are not figured out in that way, or the intermediaries are not behaving in that way, or the CPG is not paying attention to that. So first thing that I believe has to happen is a reassessment of how this is perceived and how this risk is identified and shared throughout the value system. And the reason I say that is because I believe that with this greater level of integration in the value system between the different stakeholders, I truly believe that the capital that's looking at financing this transition is going to have a better perception of the risk that's involved in making the capital available. So I believe that that's a pathway, that's a true change that needs to happen, that would really make things easier on the side of capital to be willing and able to fund these transitions. And we see that happening, right? We see over the past years, we've been seeing an increasing number of CPGs companies going closer to the farming side and starting to touch on farming and setting up sample or experimentation farms where they themselves are debuting some of these practices that are more climate smart or climate oriented, and trying to lead their supply system by example. So that's just one thing that I believe has to happen. The second thing is, on a more practical level, and then I'm going to go to the side of the capital now, is a real push to understand what the asset that is being acquired is. So we're used to talking about asset classes, but the fact of the matter is that at the end of the day, there's incredible peculiarity when we look at regions and productions and potentials. So understanding what the climate attributes are that we're buying when we're using capital to develop agriculture, understanding what the potential for water, for biodiversity, for carbon is in any specific locality, and having a genuine interest in understanding what that asset really is as opposed to just considering everything an asset class, I think would also go a long way to understanding what the true impact of that capital can be over the long term and the importance of that capital. So I'd say what goes across both sides of the discussion, or both sides of my answer, is the desire to go a little bit out of our cocoons and understand the other side a little bit better in a way that it de-risks the whole process for everyone.
Thank you, Marcelo. And I think, to your very last point, I mean, it is about de-risking, right? I mean, it's a massive opportunity. On one side, you're talking about the productivity and the gains and how it does have, and because the lines are so blurry, and because it's all interdependent and interconnected, it means the opportunity also, the opportunities and risks are shared, even though they might not be perceived as such on kind of an immediate terms, but they are shared. And I think that was a very, very clear way that you put it. How once that perception is actually made, I think it's actually not about changing how it is so much, because actually the risks are there, and it's about changing that perception. Then the pushes will come, and thank you for that, for making that explanation and connection. So I wanted to go over to back to David now. And David, we for a lot of these things, and a couple of the previous questions touched on this kind of almost sorry, I'm missing the word here, but this apparent trade-off that we've got, higher upfront costs, but more efficient, more low carbon, and so on, and the business as usual blocking in. One of our 5 principles for credible transitions from the work that we did last year actually says that technological viability trumps economic competitiveness. Also because a lot of the kind of perceived economic competitiveness on a first glance, it doesn't really stand, right? I mean, sometimes, let's take coal, for example, might be apparently more competitive in some countries, or in many countries actually, and as opposed to renewable energy that might apparently have higher upfront costs. But actually, we know that in the long term, it doesn't really add up. And if we look at the asset, or even the asset class as a whole, the big picture in terms of costs might be very different. So, how would an investor balance that apparent trade-off between longer the longevity of assets against potentially higher upfront costs, capex situation, and how would you look at that?
Well, that's a tough question. So I think we're in a moment where happily we don't have to, or at least I'm not really faced with that Sophie's choice. It is a moment in which renewable energies, it's much cheaper to build in most parts of the world, to build, for example, a wind farm or a solar farm than it is to have a coal plant. It's much cheaper. I think it's even cheaper for existing depreciated coal plants. Now, what you do with all the unemployed people in the coal plant, and how do you retrain them? That's a huge public policy discussion that in this transition, you're going to have a lot of people who will be left out unless the policy carefully takes care of them. But remember, this was part of the point that I was making before. As investors, we have a fiduciary responsibility to our investors. The money that Siemens puts at the disposal of Siemens Financial Services, and then my investment committee approves for my use to make investments, is money made available to us by shareholders, pension funds, insurance companies, people like members of this panel, who have profitability expectations, and who have given us a mandate to definitely take care of their investments. And the mandate to only invest in sustainable projects is sort of diffuse. It's more of a zeitgeist than an actual mandate. So we have to invest in projects that meet those two criteria. First of all, profitability. If not, we're not discharging obligations. So we don't have a clear mandate to ignore profitability. Having said that, because we are infrastructure investors, we are perfectly comfortable with looking at the life cycle return on investment of a long-lived asset. We don't trade stocks and hope to make money every quarter. We're looking at 30-year assets. And in those terms, this is a point you brought up earlier, which is we are concerned about the resilience of these assets and how they will perform over time. And one of the considerations is, for example, if you own a stake in a thermal-fired gas plant, like we do today in our portfolio, when we decide to exit and sell our investment and recycle that capital, so it's available to invest in what we want to do now, which is more sustainable investments, what will happen? How will the market view an investment like that? Will there be a carbon tax? So we do take this into consideration. If, as I have looked at, investing in hydro in Brazil, now more than ever, it's a very real concern. Is what is going to happen to what is happening to precipitation patterns? How will they change? And will some of these investments become non-viable? So we do take these things into consideration, but no, we will not. We cannot go into an investment and decide that we're going to accept less profitability. I need to meet both targets. Now, having said that, do I have another minute? Yeah. Okay. Having said that, I think within these three sectors, and maybe we can talk about this more in a different question, I see really attractive opportunities. But I do think there's a huge role. Some of these opportunities are not as attractive as they seem. I do think, for example, there's a huge role for the government, for public policy. This is one of the points that Dominik was making. Biofuels, you'd need, and even solar, you'd probably need another planet Earth if you wanted to run all our electricity needs, the ones we have and the ones we forecast for the next 15, 20 years. You'd need another planet just to put solar modules and just to grow biofuels to be able to fuel or generate the power we need. In other words, that's if solar remains at its current efficiency of translating solar radiation into electricity, which is around 20%, maybe 25% with trackers. Unless we see huge amounts of public, government-funded, basic R&D investment in step-up technologies that transform solar panel productivity from the current 20-25% to say 50%, we could blanket all the available space on Earth with solar modules. We're not going to achieve our targets either. So again, I'm just pointing to the limits to what smart targeted investment can do from the private sector. I'll stop there.
Thanks, David. Yeah, and I think, look, to your earlier points, I think we've got, you clearly you are looking at kind of, the lifetime and of the assets, and there is that kind of long-term planning. But to continue on your Brazil track, I've recently seen a situation where instead of decommissioning and in keeping on with the path of early decommissioning of a coal plant, it was actually sold off, and it was portrayed as avoiding a social crisis, exactly because of the workers and so on, and actually giving breath and extending that lifetime by another 20 years. So I think that it's we need more of that. We need more long-term vision of what these assets will do. And yes, we will need to make decisions, and we will need to repurpose and especially on the social side, and look at jobs and all of that. But I think we still need to have that multiplier effect of having that long-term and holistic view, because it's certainly I wouldn't say it's across the board yet, especially in some of the places that I'm looking at. So but thank you for that, and thank you for being that multiplier as well, because I know you are, and I think that's exactly what we need. We need to be looking at the full picture, and that was kind of the rationale behind the upfront question. So thank you for that, David. Dominik, I wanted you to, if you could give us a little bit more, we touched on earlier very, very briefly in terms of the opportunity, right? And you talked about, we need to build these ships now. We need these ships to be efficient now, because, it's going to take another 2-3 years for them to be built, and then a little while longer before they can be operational, and then of course they're going to be there for decades in the oceans. Can you give us a glimpse of what is the viable pipeline of transition investments for shipping? And you talked about a little bit of what it takes to incentivize, but if you can talk a little bit about that with the lens of scaling up this pipeline. So again, my same point that I made to Marcelo: we need scale. We're talking about trillions here, and we're talking about transforming the industry. So what does it look like, and what will it take?
Thank you very much, Tati. As I said earlier, there are more and more progressive businesses in shipping that are really calling for full decarbonization by 2050. And for example, the Getting to Zero Coalition is going to publish a call to action signed by, I think, something like 200 shipping companies, major shipping companies, during the United Nations General Assembly that is going to take place in 2 weeks, really calling upon their peers, calling upon the International Maritime Organization to revise the target to say we don't need at least minus 50% by 2050, we need full decarbonization. And one of the companies that actually announced such a target already, I think it's 3 years ago, is Maersk, a Danish shipping company, the largest container ship company on earth. And they said already by 2050, all our vessels are going to emit zero emissions, and there will be no carbon emissions from our fleet anymore. And they actually also, they follow up with action. And just a couple of weeks ago, they ordered their 8 vessels, which are expected to run on methanol. And they already decided to invest $1.4 billion in that. And I just read yesterday an interview by the Maersk CEO saying kind of, calling for fossil fuels for ships to be forbidden in the future. So there is a clear drive in the industry. There is a small pipeline that exists already, and that small pipeline, I would say, is growing every week with more and more projects. Just to give you a few more examples, the 2 big ship engine manufacturers, we are talking about MAN here, and we are talking about Wärtsilä. They already announced that kind of by 2024, you're going to have commercially viable ammonia engines for sale that can be installed on ships. But it's not only the industry that is really building this pipeline. We also need to talk about the fuel supply that are set and these tremendous business opportunities and development opportunities for many countries, including developing countries. More and more, I would say, sorry for using this metaphor, that it's not really appropriate, but jumping on the train. So more and more are really kind of coming out there, coming forward and saying kind of, okay, we're going to produce these zero carbon bunker fuels. We are seeing a lot of green ammonia and green hydrogen production efforts in North Europe, not surprisingly, Northern Europe kind of with Scandinavia and so on, but also around the world. There is kind of, Chile is one of the countries that has been the most vocal about wanting to become a global hub for green fuels. Morocco is doing the same in Northern Africa. And just recently, we have seen studies on South Africa green shipping fuels, Indonesia and Mexico. And the important thing that we need really to scale up that pipeline and to bring these pilot and demonstration projects to industrial scale, where they are really not niche anymore, but really something that has entered into the mainstream of the sector, is we really, you mentioned this early on, we need to de-risk the first movers. We have to make it as easy and as compelling for them as possible. And this can be done, I think, by two things. Governments can really support these pilot and demonstration projects at industrial scale through direct subsidies, through fiscal incentives, through making sure that they expedite the bureaucratic process for permits and so on, that they provide whatever risk guarantees to these projects. And at the same time, industry can do the same. Industry can move forward, and we see this where long charter contracts, so charterers that usually kind of charter ships in order to transport the goods around the world. They say kind of, we're going to enter into a long contract with the ship owner and say kind of, we serve to for you as an offtake provider, and give you an offtake guarantee. If you run on green fuels, we're going to be with you for the next, let's say, for example, 10 or 15 years. And we also see this from kind of retail companies. So really that the companies that face the end consumer that are getting more and more willing to pay a premium for a zero carbon, a carbon neutral product, where they can also claim it has been transported without any emissions around the world. One example just there is, for example, IKEA, that is very much interested in being able to offer to their customers carbon neutral furniture that may have been produced in one part of the world, but has been transported without emitting any greenhouse gases to the actual end customer destination.
Thank you, Dominik. I feel like your comments have sparked immediate reaction from David, and I feel like he's going to answer the question that I was going to direct to him anyway. So, David, go ahead, make your comments and react.
Thanks, Thatyanne. I wanted to highlight a point that Dominik just made, which I think is actually really important for our understanding of how we can unlock this Gordian knot of what comes first: investment. How do we spur on this transition? And the de-risking part is actually really, really important. If you look at green hydrogen, and green hydrogen is actually really important for transportation. It could be really important and transformational for Marcelo, for his sector, for agriculture. Just a statistic, 40% of the fertilizer used globally is based on petrochemicals. So in some way, it's fossil fuel based. Being able to have green hydrogen as a precursor to ammonia, to be able to produce fertilizer, is also would be a huge step change. But what's the issue there as an investor? And this points to Dominik's concept of de-risking. We, from physics, you all know that work produces heat. That's why whenever we exert ourselves and work out, we get really tired, we get really hot, because a lot of the energy that we're putting into work just gets dissipated as heat. So every time you transform, solar or wind into electricity, there's a significant amount of loss of energy. And if you think about it, you're transforming wind or sun into electricity, loss. Then you're transforming the electricity into hydrogen, another loss. Then you're transforming the hydrogen, probably burning it and going through a turbine to generate electricity, another loss. It's actually really, really inefficient to have that path to produce green hydrogen. The shorter path, much more efficient from a thermodynamic point of view, is what's going on now, which is you get methane from fossil fuels, and excuse me, it is a fossil fuel, and you steam reform it to produce hydrogen. Now, unless someone like the government imposes a carbon tax so that you can actually see the cost of producing methane through fossil fuels, so that you have a comparison with your green hydrogen, it really isn't economical, except for very few cases, to produce green hydrogen. This is disconcerting. Now I'm seeing myself talk. And so the de-risking here would come about through a change in government policy in establishing, for example, a carbon market so that we investors could respond to incentives. That would be one way of de-risking. And if you think about it, the costs of this transition are going to be borne by everybody. So we do have to find a way of having those costs be shared by everyone, and not just having the risks and the rewards, obviously, and not just having the risks taken up by investors. When we look at low-income housing, it would be a great opportunity for new low-income housing, which is a hugely underserved market in Brazil, to be built already with certain efficiency standards, LED lighting, and solar panels. What's the problem there? Low-income housing is a very difficult market. Excuse me, it's a very difficult counterparty. If you're thinking of financing something that depends on income streams from people with low income, that's a really risky undertaking unless the government steps in to somehow provide or share some of the risks. Otherwise, the kind of rates that you're going to charge for an investment that relies on someone who's paying the fees that doesn't have much income are going to make this as an investment unfeasible. Or the government comes in and figures out a way to provide the market with information that today doesn't exist. A lot of these low-income populations are actually don't have credit histories, but they do pay regularly. But that kind of information is not available to investors. Making that information available would probably be a good policy incentive, again, to de-risk. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, David. Well, I think that's a good segue onto a question for Cristina, who I'm sure will have reactions, especially to that last point on housing. So I'll be very quick to share one of the questions that came through for you, Cristina, and you can take on that discussion. Carbon neutrality in buildings have a heavier emphasis on the operational emissions. However, embodied emissions also pose a significant carbon risk. What are the World Green Buildings actions to address this challenge?
Thank you very much for that question. Yes, so the World Green Building Council is a network of networks. We have 70 green building councils around the world. And I'm saying this because the swap card, I have several asks of people wanting to invest. I can connect you to the companies and the leaders in the segment. And I'm mentioning this because it goes to what Dominik was also mentioning of the leaders, of the leadership in opening the possibility and unblocking and de-risking for others to do the same. 5 years ago, we set up a program called Advancing Net Zero, and today we have a community of business, cities, states, and regions, state of California, Scotland, 28 cities with C40, signed up to a net zero carbon buildings commitment. They are committed to operating all their assets net zero by 2030 or taking other sorts of measures. So in real time today, and it includes a community also of banks that have signed our commitment. And they are doing this through reducing energy demand and addressing carbon emissions, meaning that we are taking action through those principles we set out And of course, that proposal, if you like, continues to be refined. 3 years ago, operational carbon, I said in the introduction, 38% of global greenhouse gas emissions are related to the building's performance, but basically of that, almost 10% of that 38% is embodied carbon, as a question from our audience is saying. So what is the industry doing about it? There is a report from 2019 bringing embodied carbon up front, and currently the commitment, the World GBC's commitment, is being upgraded, and the community of 140 businesses, cities, states, and regions are now committed to a whole life carbon approach towards 2030. What does it mean for all of this? I guess we're saying the most sustainable building today is the one that already exists. Buildings that are up still have huge carbon debt to pay. So embodied carbon means that we need to reduce and account for the impact on the environment and natural resources through better design and construction of anything that is going to be built in the future, addressing, of course, even the emissions of the phase of construction, linking a lot to transportation. The electrification of transportation in that segment is critical, and that the industry starts holding accountable all the value chain, meaning that we're bringing scope 3 into the conversation. And that is generating a strong and urgent demand signal to supply chains and investors to activate the necessary finance to decarbonize all the industries that are linked up, right? And we now know that net zero is one of the biggest business opportunities of this decade. And as we go into COP26 and we hear all the silver linings, we do know that those low carbon solutions, better access to them that need a lot of investment today, will create more mobilization within the industry, and us as consumers, we will be more sensitive to having, let's say, a better expectation of performance of the buildings. So embodied is pretty much, or upfront emissions was a blind spot, if you like, of the industry. We're bringing in up front and center, and this net zero carbon buildings community is acting on it. And there's portfolios decarbonizing as we speak. There are cities enacting policies for procurement. There are countries like Scotland even setting up a net zero minister, right, that is addressing infrastructure. And I think this is a transition in itself, and it's the way forward for industry. So there's a lot of transparency that needs to happen, environmental product declarations. There is a lot of accounting that needs to happen, agreeing on data sets and sharing them and being transparent. And a key one for finance, of course, is as the industry discloses that we can, if you like, protect that data, right? And make sure that the carbon markets and all this trading that will happen as I'm confident policy shapes up towards carbon taxes can enable transparency, and businesses will be confident to continue to go in this direction. And I guess I would say finally that if businesses are not adapting today to this direction of travel, when finally policy picks up speed, which it will, they will not be ready to operate at the new levels of expectation. So as we create together the journey, as we go on the pathways of decarbonization together, we can bring along the reality of the transition and have an honest and frank conversation on how to unlock this, to raise all boats, using again the transportation sector, and not leave anyone behind in this change going forward. And just a little bit, as David, one more minute, housing, decarbonizing buildings is not technology intensive. All of this climate action is also common sense and bringing our hearts to decision making. Passive design and simple systems that are responsive to the end user, for example, in affordable housing, can create a house that is comfortable for users. And of course, then we can make them ready as families grow in capacity and income capacity to fund them to continue to make them net zero ready, if you like. So it doesn't have to be front loaded in investments. They can be adaptive. They can be helpful to families as they grow. And so then we don't have stranded assets in a few years, but rather we help that biggest asset investment be helpful for both planet, people, and make it a reasonable investment opportunity.
Thank you very much for that, Cristina. And thank you for packing so much into that answer. So I wanted to just share one very final question with Marcelo, and then we will have to wrap up in 5 minutes. Marcelo, what are the low-hanging fruits in agriculture that you mentioned? But I think especially the second part of the question, which is how far would focusing on these actually take us? And are they low-hanging because of costs or because of being technically easy to adopt?
Well, thanks for the question, Tati. I'll try to be brief here. I know we have a diverse audience and a global audience. So breaking this up between inside the farm gate and outside the farm gate. Inside the farm gate, everything is extremely local, as we know, and dependent on location. I would say that we have opportunities and practices and inputs and in technology. So just to cite an example, in terms of practices, the simple use of cover crops, which, for example, in the US right now is somewhere between 5 to 10% of the total agricultural landscape, meaning that we still have 90% of opportunity there. The simple use of cover crops is something that goes a long way in terms of environmentally, being environmentally friendly. On the input side, there's a lot of proven results with biologicals, with the increased use of biological inputs as opposed to synthetic inputs, something that Dominik and David mentioned. So the sources of nitrogen, for example, how we go about finding and locating that nitrogen and what kind of nitrogen you're using, for example, is something that is pretty manageable inside the farm gate. Sometimes you have good sources of nitrogen that are not synthetic and you're not looking at those. And last, on the technology side, agriculture has never seen as much technology as it sees today. The number of ag tech companies out there grows exponentially by the day. And even though there's a lot of technology that's still nascent and has to be proven, there's a lot of technology that has already been proved and that can be uptaken by farmers pretty easily with substantial results. I'll just give you one example. We use predictive climate models, for example, which allow us to understand what's going to happen in terms of rainfall. And then whenever we need irrigation, as opposed to just looking at the past and saying, I've been without water for the past 7 days, so I might need to run my irrigation system now, we're looking at the future. But that takes looking at advanced climate prediction models. And that has actually saved us using or prevented us from using water unnecessarily, because even though we had come off of a long dry period, we knew that rain was just around the corner because we had access to those predictive data models. So that's out there. It's not expensive. It can be used by many farmers, and it would immediately save a lot of unnecessary irrigation. Outside the farm gate, I would cite two things that I believe are pretty actionable from the CPG side, for example. I think we can refine commercial models. I think we can redesign some of those commercial models in a way that the CPGs and the people that are further downstream from the farm and interested in buying crops can help share in the risk that comes with the uptake of some of these practices in the short term, even though we know that in a couple of years' time, that's going to be good for everyone. So let's say that a farmer in a supply network decides to uptake regenerative practices, and that might entail some CapEx cost in the beginning. The CPG or the intermediary further down the value chain can go back to the farmer and say, well, I'll share in with you here. I'll pay you a little bit more if you have a dip in your production because of that first year transition, for example, and we'll share in that risk over the next 3 or 4 or 5 years, and we'll take this as a long-term process, right? So if the intermediaries or the CPGs are willing to go in that direction, that will go a long way towards being part of this financing of the transition, in addition to all of the capital that's out there. And the sheer fact that this allegiance is happening would also incentivize external capital to look at this as a productive transformation process and be willing to chip in and play their part. So just briefly here, I think those are some examples of low-hanging fruits across the value system there.
Thank you very much for that, Marcelo, and especially thank you for being straight to the point and managing to answer that in a very short time. Thank you. I did want to thank once again all of our panelists. I think the main messages we heard from here today is what we need accountability from everyone across the different sectors and supply chains. We need long-term view of risks. But there is a very clear demand for pathways. Transition is here, it has started, and the opportunities are everywhere. And finally, very clear signal from investors, which is there will be a higher cost of capital, if any, for those who don't transition. So you've been warned, basically. I wanted to thank once again Marcelo Marzola from Vayda Farms, Dominik Englert from the World Bank, Cristina Gamboa from the World Green Building Council, and David Taff from Siemens Financial Services. It's been a pleasure to be with you guys today, and I hope to see you all again soon. Bye.
Thank you, Tatjana.
Thank you very much for having us. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Everybody.
Bye-bye.